Hello, friends. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Michelle Fondin, and I'm the author of 11 published books, including Chakra Healing for Vibrant Energy, exploring your 7 energy centers with mindfulness, yoga, and Ayurveda. I'm also the author of Heal Yourself, A Return to Wholeness, the integration of body, mind, soul, and spirit. You can purchase all of my 11 published books on Amazon. If you're new to my channel, welcome. Thank you for subscribing below. Click on the bells, scroll up to all for all notifications. And thank you for giving the video a thumbs up. You can join my meditation course online and get your personalized mantra in Sanskrit from me over Zoom. The links to register are all below. Welcome to my video series on exploring your inner world. This is on your spiritual journey, your spiritual awakening journey. And today we're going to talk about the ego death, or is it really an ego death? And the shadow work that you do during your spiritual awakening journey. I really want to talk about this concept of the ego death. And in fact, in my video on the 4th sign of a spiritual awakening, I'll put the link right there to that. I spoke about not believing in the ego death. I don't believe that's what it should be called, but that's what the common terminology is. And in fact, in this book, Heal Yourself, A Return to Wholeness, I talk all about my theory on the ego and the ego death. So you can get more info on that from this book. Let's speak about my philosophy on the ego, on ego death during a spiritual awakening and while you're doing your shadow work. First and foremost, what is the ego? The ego is the part of you that recognizes you. It's your personality. It's what you came into this earth as. You came in as a spiritual being having a human experience. So you have a physical body, you have an emotional body, you have a spiritual body, you have a mind, intellect, and ego. You have something called the collective soul, the universal soul, the individual soul. You are part of your environment. You have an energy body. The ego is part of that central part of you that is composed of the mind, the intellect, and the ego. So the ego itself is your self-identity. Some of you know I've been studying astrology for several years now, and the father of evolutionary astrology, Jeffrey Wolf Green, in one of his videos, yes, videos, not online, on DVD, in the course that I have been taking, he states that without the ego, you could not utter your own name. And this is true. It's true. The ego part of you is your self-identity. It's your personality. It's how you express yourself in this world. It's how people recognize you as a person in this world. So you have an ego. Everybody else has their individual ego. And that is the forward-facing part of you. It's like a business, right? You have a business, you have the branding, the logo, the name of the business. That's how you recognize the business. Otherwise, you wouldn't recognize the business if it didn't have something front-facing, if it didn't have something out there in the open for people to recognize and then to buy a service or a product. In the same way, your ego shows the world who you are as a person, as a human being. So do you see where I'm going here about why it's important to have an ego? So just like a business, so I like that. I just came up with that on the spot. Like a business, I'm not going to name any businesses, but like a business that has a logo, a website design, a tagline, that's important for other people to know what it is that they're buying into. You, as a person, you have a name that your parents gave you, most likely. You have a personality that is in part of your soul, but it's also a part of your human personality that was developed through your upbringing and education and parenting. And you have traits that you've developed over time on this earthly journey. So that is all part of your ego. And it's really important that you know that. We're not trying to stomp on the ego and kill the ego. You need an ego as long as you are alive on this earth plane. Sorry if I'm bursting your bubble because you learned stuff from other YouTube channels or other books that told you the contrary. So no, you do need an ego. You have to have an ego. Like, how would you win over a lover, or how would you even get a job if you didn't have an ego, right? You can't just be this selfless glob of spirit floating around. You wouldn't get anything done. You wouldn't even eat food if you didn't have an ego. So we have this ego. Now, I'm making fun of it a little bit in the sense that saying you do need an ego. Why are we ashamed of the ego? We shouldn't be ashamed of the ego. That's part of who you are. Because if you are body, energy body, environmental body, if you're mind, intellect, and ego, if you are individual soul, collective soul, and universal soul, then those are many things that comprise the person that is you. So you have this individual ego that really sets you apart from other people. However, where it becomes problematic is the ego is about individuality. It's about me, myself, and I, and me first. It's part of the survivalist part of you, but it's also the part of you that wants to individuate. When you came here on Earth, you wanted to individuate. You wanted to be unique. You wanted to have an individual experience. And so that is why you also have an individual form of your soul, because your individual form of your soul, which is not really separate from source or universe, whatever you want to call it, the individual part of your soul wanted to have a certain experience. So you have this individual ego that separates itself from the crowd, separates itself out from others because you wanted to have an individuated experience. However, you have the soul part of you that also wants to have a human experience, a spiritual experience, and a collective experience. And the soul part of you is trying to make its way back to merge into oneness. Now, neither one of those things are completely wrong, right? Your need for individuality, your need to express yourself as an individual, or your need to merge back into oneness. Neither one of those are wrong. But as long as you are here on Earth having this experience, you need to maintain somewhat of an individuality. Otherwise, you would just abandon your body. And most of us don't want to do that, right? Most of us don't want to abandon our bodies right now. Not now, at least. It becomes problematic when your individual part of you, right? In part the ego, in part the individualized soul, but mostly the ego, becomes problematic because it's very survivalist. It's very much focused on me, myself, and I. It's focused on, I gotta get mine before others get it. And it wants to keep you in fear of not surviving. Here's why. When you merge back into oneness with source, you lose the ego. You drop the ego. You pick one up on your way back in the next lifetime, but you drop the ego as you merge back into oneness. So as you drop your ego, you still have your individual soul that's a part of you that kind of travels with you. But as you drop the ego loses its force because in the spirit realm, you really don't need the ego. So that's where it gets really weird, right? So you're trying to have a spiritual experience here on Earth as a human being, or as a spiritual being having a human experience. But then the ego is saying, hey, you don't need all that spiritual stuff. No, stay here. Do earthly things. Get ahead. Get hurt. Get immersed in it. And so because the ego wants to individuate, it's constantly comparing itself to other egos. It's constantly in competition with other egos. It keeps you in fear of not being good enough. And so that's where it becomes super problematic. What I suggest in my teachings is that we acknowledge the ego as something good. First and foremost, you acknowledge the ego as something good and you thank the ego for bringing you along this journey. so that you could say your name, so that you can get a job and find a lover if that's what you choose. But thank the ego for that individuated part of who you are. So you want to acknowledge it. You want to appreciate it. You want to tell it, hey, good job for bringing me along up until now. And you want to ensure the ego that it still has a role in your life so that when you start to meditate, when you get closer to spirit, when you get closer to merging with oneness, even while you're still alive, that the ego doesn't feel threatened. So what I'd like to say is you are taming the ego. You might be transcending the ego so that you can feel oneness with your soul, but the ego's still coming along for the journey, right? So that's not an ego death. If you want to give it a term, it's an ego transcendence or an ego taming. You're going to put a little leash on the ego and say, you can come along with me for the journey, but you're not going to keep me in fear and you're not going to keep me crushing other people, albeit other egos. You can come along for the journey, but you really have to work with soul. If you work with soul and you guys are working well together, then we have a deal. And so that's what spiritual awakening is about as you're working through the shadow side. Another word for shadow side really is the ego side, right? Because stuff that comes up with the ego, I'm hurt, this person hurt me, I went through this, poor me. When you go through that, that's mostly ego stuff talking, right? It's mostly what you have been through in the individuated person that you are, that has had these experiences and that has these latent impressions through memories and emotions that have been stuffed down or not completely processed. That's really ego that you're dealing with. So as you're doing your shadow work, that's who you're really dealing with, is your ego. So it's not about crushing it. It's not about the death of it. That's so silly. It's really about transcending it in a way that it can then work with you. Okay, and I don't even like the word transcendence for it as much. And I did write that. Look, I wrote the book in 2020. People can change. But I do have a sub-chapter on the ego, and it's called ego transcendence. So, if you like the term ego transcendence, stick with that. I would say now it's more about taming the ego, getting it to work with your individual higher self, and so that it can work in concert. Because let's talk about the flip side real quick, and we're not going to make this into a 45-minute video, I promise you. We're going to talk about the flip side really quickly. A lot of people on the spiritual journey that have this notion or concept that the ego must die, die ego, or I must crush the ego. People that have this mentality wind up being pretty spineless in this life. And they don't feel happy in this life. They feel very depressed. They feel suppressed. They feel a sense of disempowerment. A lot of people go through these stages where they're just constantly seeking something. They're seeking a new healing modality. They're seeking a new guru. They remain in poverty because they think, oh, I have to be ego-less. And in order to be a spiritual person, I have to have no ego. And they go through life really depressed, because when you lose your sense of self, you are depressed. You have to have a sense of self in this lifetime. And there's no shame in having a sense of self. There's no shame in having your personality. There's no shame in having these human experiences. There's no shame in having money, right? You need money to survive on Earth. That's just the way it is, guys. That is just the way it is. I hope I've inspired you to look at your spiritual journey a little differently than the mainstream, a little differently than most people want to interpret it, because I've studied this stuff for a long time, a couple of decades at least, more than a couple of decades. And I've come to this conclusion through my readings of the Yoga Sutras. I've come to this conclusion through my readings of the ancient Vedic texts, the Upanishads, through the Dhammapada, which is the workings of the Buddha, I've come to this conclusion about the ego. And it's pretty spot on, because when I look at all the spiritual seekers out there that are lost, just wanderers of the world, 100% lost, just clinging on to the latest guru, teacher, healing modality, crystals, whatever it is, they're just clinging on to all these different things because they think that, like, I have to be a spiritual being. I can't be an ego. I have to be 100% selfless. And then they become doormats and people walk all over them and take advantage of them, because you really need that presence. Just like families need a mother and a father, right? I mean, I know the world is changing. I know the world is very different today than it was when I was born, but there is a balance to things, right? There's a balance to things. There's a balance to the universe. There is a yin to the yang. There's a yang to the yin. So when we get terribly out of balance, such as crashing the ego down to a pulp and trying to be all spiritual, but still living here, it takes things completely out of balance. So embrace your ego, love it to death, but not to death. Love it like a friend, and just, ask it to work with spirit. And you can do that in every situation. When you find yourself getting too self-important, when you find yourself competing against somebody else, criticizing somebody else, trying to make yourself feel superior to somebody else. And I'm sorry, I just touched the mic. You can always go back to ego and go, hey, ego, that's not very nice. Can we be nice? Can we be nicer to people and give them a break? And that's how you work with the ego. It's like recognizing it when you're being critical of others, when you're in that competitive mode, when you are finding yourself superior to others, the ways that we have been taught to live in fear. So when you recognize this, you can just change it. Just change it. Just talk to the ego, talk to your higher self, say, where's the compromise here? And it works. It does work because you're more self-aware. You're not selfless in the sense of not having a self, but you're self-aware. And that is what transcendence of the ego is about. It's about that self-awareness. So I hope this was helpful for you on your spiritual journey. I want to thank you so much for joining me here today. Thank you for subscribing to my channel below. Click on the bell, scroll up to all for all notifications. Thank you for giving the video a thumbs up. Thank you for sharing this video with others who are on a spiritual journey. Thank you for your support of my YouTube channel. You can purchase one of my 11 published books. You can join my meditation class. The links are all below. And I will see you in the next video.